This is Mr. Wesley, and the arrangement that feels like the safest possible foundation for a marriage in your 30s becomes, statistically and specifically, one of the most financially dangerous arrangements a man can be inside by the time he reaches his late 50s. I am talking about the single-income household built around a wife who does not work outside the home across decades of marriage. Not as a moral judgment about that arrangement, many of these marriages are genuinely happy, genuinely functional, built on real mutual agreement about how to run a household and raise children. I'm talking about something narrower and more specific. The economic structure of that arrangement creates a particular and predictable financial exposure for the husband that almost nobody explains to him clearly when he agrees to it. And that exposure becomes fully visible only decades later, at exactly the moment in life when he has the least remaining time to recover from it. Stay with me, because today I want to walk you through exactly how this trap is built, piece by piece, across the decades when nobody is paying attention to it, what the legal mechanics actually do to a man's net worth when the marriage ends, and what a man currently inside a healthy version of this arrangement can do right now to protect both himself and his wife from the version of this story that ends badly. I am Mr. Wesley. This is Relational Insights. Let me show you the mechanics from the foundation up. Here is where the trap begins, and it begins decades before either person could see it coming. In a single-income household, every dollar of retirement savings, every year of pension accrual, every contribution to a 401k or its equivalent is generated entirely through one person's labor. That sounds, on its face, like it should mean the person whose labor produced it has some special claim to it when the marriage ends. It does not work that way under the equitable distribution framework I described in detail in the no-fault divorce video earlier in this series. The law treats those accumulated assets as marital property, regardless of whose income generated them, because the non-earning spouse's contribution, running the household, raising children, supporting the earning spouse's career across decades of long hours and demanding schedules, is treated as an equivalent and equally valid contribution to the marriage's overall economic output. That principle has genuine merit in many cases, and I want to be honest about that rather than treating it as simply unfair. What it produces, mechanically, in the single-income household specifically, is the largest possible base of dividable assets relative to the smallest possible number of separate financial identities, which is precisely the configuration that produces the most severe wealth drop on divorce of any marital structure I have analyzed across this series. Here is the second layer of the trap, and it is the one almost nobody discusses honestly in the years when discussing it could actually change something. The non-earning spouse in this arrangement has spent decades outside the workforce, and that absence has a specific and compounding cost that is rarely calculated by either party until the marriage ends and a lawyer calculates it for them. Her earning capacity, had she remained employed continuously across those same decades, would have grown the way anyone's does. Promotions, accumulated skill, her own retirement contributions building in parallel rather than depending entirely on his. Instead, in the event of divorce, the law in many jurisdictions recognizes this gap explicitly through spousal support calculated specifically to compensate for those lost decades of earning potential, on top of the equal division of the assets the husband alone generated through his employment. The arrangement that felt, for 30 years, like a single efficient household running cleanly on one income, becomes, at the precise point of divorce, two separate and simultaneous financial claims against the exact same pool of money. The equal division of everything he built, plus an ongoing monthly support obligation, calculated against what she did not build, because the very structure of the marriage prevented her from building it in parallel. Picture this. There is a man I know who ran a single-income household for 31 years. He had been, by every conventional measure available to him, a careful and disciplined provider, maximizing his retirement contributions every year without fail, building substantial equity in the family home, advancing steadily across 3 decades in a career that had supported the entire household comfortably and without complaint. When the marriage ended at 59, he discovered, in the same settlement meeting, 2 separate numbers on 2 separate pages that he had never once expected to see attached to his name in the same document. The first was the equal division of essentially everything he had built across those 3 decades of disciplined work. The second was a monthly spousal support figure, calculated by a vocational economist hired by his wife's attorney, specifically to project what her own earning trajectory would likely have looked like had she remained in the workforce continuously since their wedding. He told me that no single piece of paper in the entire 18-month process devastated him as completely as understanding, for the first time and far too late to do anything about it, that the household he had been so genuinely proud of running efficiently on one income was, in the eyes of the law that would now determine the rest of his financial life, not one unified achievement, but two entirely separate financial obligations that had simply been running in parallel without his awareness for 31 years. I want to be precise that this is not a story about a husband being victimized by a calculating or vindictive wife. In the overwhelming majority of marriages built on this structure, neither person designed the arrangement with eventual divorce in mind, and the wife's contribution to the household across those decades was real, substantial, and entirely deserving of legal recognition. I am not making an argument against equitable distribution or against spousal support as concepts. What I am describing is a structural feature of the single-income marriage that exists regardless of either person's intentions or character. A feature that sits dormant and invisible for decades and becomes financially catastrophic specifically when it collides with the gray divorce timing I've described across this entire series. A settlement arriving at 55 or 60 with no remaining working decades available to rebuild what the settlement has just removed. Here is what to actually do with this information if you are currently inside this exact arrangement and the marriage is genuinely healthy, because the purpose of this video is not to frighten you out of a structure that may be working well for your family. It is to help you protect it deliberately rather than assuming, the way most men do, that its stability is simply permanent and requires no further attention. The first protection is a clear and honestly negotiated prenuptial or postnuptial agreement, drafted with the involvement of a financial specialist rather than left entirely to the default framework of your state's equitable distribution law. A postnuptial agreement in particular, drafted years into an already established single-income marriage, can specifically address how this exact financial exposure would be handled if the marriage ended, structured in a way that is genuinely fair to both parties rather than catastrophic to one of them by accident of legal default. This is not a hostile or distrustful document when it is approached correctly. It is the same kind of ordinary foresight a sensible couple would apply to any other major and long-term shared financial undertaking. The second protection is maintaining your spouse's connection to some form of professional certification, part-time work, or ongoing skill development across the marriage, even minimally, even if it amounts to no more than a few hours a week, or periodic recertification in a field she once worked in. This measurably reduces the size of any later spousal support calculation because it directly addresses the earning capacity gap that the calculation is designed to compensate for, while simultaneously and genuinely benefiting her own long-term independence and security, regardless of what ultimately happens to the marriage. This protection serves both of you, not just you, which is precisely why it is easier to propose and easier for her to accept than a document drafted purely around the possibility of divorce. The third protection is an honest and regularly updated shared understanding of exactly what the marital estate actually contains, reviewed by both of you together, on some kind of recurring schedule, rather than managed unilaterally by whichever one of you happens to handle the household finances day to day. This single habit, more than almost anything else I've described across this series, prevents the specific and devastating blindsiding that defines so many of the stories I have told you. A marriage where both partners genuinely know the shape of their shared financial life is a marriage where neither partner can be technically correct and still be functionally ambushed by a settlement neither of them saw coming. The 1950s arrangement was never inherently unstable, and I want to close on that point, because I do not want this video to be received as an argument against a structure that has produced genuine happiness and genuine partnership for a great many families. What was missing was never the structure itself. What was missing was the honest financial conversation that should have accompanied it from the very beginning, and that almost nobody has, because having it feels, in the moment, like planning for a divorce you do not want, do not expect, and have no intention of having. The men who navigate this structure most successfully across decades are not the men who avoided it out of caution. They are the men who built it with their eyes fully open to exactly what it would mean, financially and legally, decades later, if the marriage did not last, and who used that clarity not to undermine the arrangement, but to make it genuinely solid for both people inside it. Drop a comment. Men, if your household has run on a single income for most of your marriage, have you and your spouse ever actually had an honest conversation about what a divorce would look like financially? And if you have not had that conversation yet, what has been keeping you from starting it? Subscribe to Relational Insights. Every week, Mr. Wesley breaks down the financial and psychological realities of marriage and divorce after 50 that nobody explains clearly until it is far too late to act on them.